Today, the Climate Action Forum of Stanford Alumni and Sustainability will introduce you to three rising stars in the field. I'm Naomi Boak, Stanford class of 74, a television producer turned park ranger. In 2019, I left New York City for Katmai National Park in Alaska, where I lived with 100 brown bears as my neighbors, and I taught the world about them. Until this year, I also co-produced Fat Bear Week, a social media phenom that uses the charisma of bears to underscore the importance of protecting ecosystems and the planet. Today, I work at New Bedford Whaling National Historical Park in Massachusetts. The Climate Action Forum of Stanford Alumni and Sustainability was started by some of us in the class of 74, but we're getting gray. And work in climate is about the future. So today we introduce you to three alums who are carving out their futures and ours by working in the field. So first, I'll tell you about Christian Brown. Christian is an engineering manager at Tapestry, Alphabet's moonshot for the electric grid, where he uses simulation, artificial intelligence, and machine learning to accelerate power and grid planning. He earned both his bachelor's and his master's in energy resources engineering with a focus on machine learning and optimization, all while competing on Stanford's varsity swim team. He knows how to get up early, I guess. Lily Joy Winder is a new graduate in the master's program as of today through Stanford's Schneider Sustainability Energy Fellowships program. Lily Joy is holding the fossil fuel industry accountable through policy at Natural Resources Defense Council as their oil and gas fellow. She just earned her master's in Earth Systems after an undergraduate degree in Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity and a minor in Native American Studies. Samir Chaudhry. Samir is currently on the deal team at D.E. Shaw Renewable Investments, where he supports financing for some of the nation's largest power infrastructure projects. He is also the founder and executive director of University Climate Ventures, a national platform accelerating university climate and deep tech entrepreneurship. Samir currently leads the New York chapter of Stanford Alumni in Climate Tech. Samir earned his bachelor's in management science and engineering and master's from the Dorr School in Sustainability, Science, and Practice. All right, now you're done with my face on the screen, and we're going to talk to the people you really want to hear from. Let's start with you, Samir. Why finance? Every sustainable venture obviously needs financing, but we often think of finance as the enemy of climate resilience. Tell us why that assumption is wrong.
Yeah, 100%. Thanks, Naomi, for the introduction. I actually started in the environmental justice space, and I remember when I was in high school reading books about how the fossil fuel industry spent so much time on anti-climate propaganda and disguising so many investments that were branded as climate positive but were actually very climate negative. And I know what as a result, like why the industry has a very negative appeal, oftentimes because capitalism clashes with climate. That's historically what environmental justice activists have viewed the industry, and in many ways they're right. But I also think finance is a very multidisciplinary industry as well. And I do believe as well that there are times where the economic case is often aligned with the most sustainable outcome. I think energy infrastructure is a great example of this right now. The cost of solar has gone down dramatically over the past decades and now is very comparable to a lot of dirty fossil fuel energy sources, if not cheaper, majority of the time. And in my work day to day, I spend my job raising debt and capital to build and construct these power infrastructure projects, solar projects, battery storage projects across the nation. And so I think it's important in this scenario to just not put a blanket perception over the industry, but recognize it for the interdisciplinary nature that it kind of really holds.
Yeah, I think we often forget that, when we're doing this work, that we need the money to do it, and we need the money to back other people to begin using sustainable resources like solar. So that's great. LeJoy, when I think of climate activism and environmental justice, I automatically think of Natural Resources Defense Council on the front lines of so many lawsuits to stop assaults on our planet. But you're not a lawyer. Tell us more about your work.
My Schneider Fellowship doesn't start until September, so I have some time before I start that job. But in terms of my work, when it comes to dealing with frontline communities and what that looks like on the day to day, it really means building relationships with people who are aligned. That doesn't always mean um, building relationships in indigenous communities. That means people who are just willing to look outside of the Western canon of how we deal with the environment. When I look at what we need to do in the future, we really need to reassess our relationship with the earth and how we operate and move away from these more extractive models that we obviously cannot sustain forever and figure out what it looks like to live in reciprocity. So I try and make that a an ethic that I take everywhere, whether that's just my relationships with colleagues, whether that and hopefully ripples out to my relationships that I build with the environments around me when it comes to what I think is a priority for me right now. And what should be a priority right now is as we are looking, more people are interested in traditional ecological knowledge and what that means for implementing that. And for people who don't know, traditional ecological knowledge is referred a lot in academic circles as indigenous practices, although it can include non-indigenous practices. It primarily refers to how indigenous people conducted themselves prior to colonialization and their relationships to the earth. When I look at how that can be actually tangibly implemented, it starts with relationship building with the people that have that knowledge and understanding where they're coming from. All different tribes have different capacities to implement TEK principles, um, and that comes from a range of capacity issues, whether that's language and language revitalization, or the funds too, going back to Samir, what he works on in finance. Different tribes are dealing with different issues when it comes to sustainability, and some tribes are way far beyond and thinking really broad scale in ways that are very exciting. There's 535 federally recognized tribes in the United States, many more that are not federally recognized. And so right now, when I look at day to day and what's important for me, it's that relationship building, because when we're going to meet that real grind in the future, and we're going to hit some major bumps in the road, we're going to need fortified relationships with people who have had long sustaining relationships with the environment.
Yeah, well, I'm sure that you will, once you start at NRDC, are going to translate that knowledge and that passion to NRDC, because I know that they believe that too. And I know that from my time in Alaska and also my work here in Massachusetts, that there's so many lessons to learn from indigenous attitudes towards the earth. I mean, we're part of the earth, right? And we've lost that in our American culture, but in Alaska, that attitude and that practice was very much present and appreciated by me. And I wish there were more like you, really, Joy, out there. Christian Brown, let's see how you're going to be contributing to all of our work, because you're working in AI. How do you bring your AI work to the goals that Lily and Samir have talked about?
Happy to talk about my perspective on sort of how AI fits
Right.
into these things. I've worked in a couple of different places in energy. I've worked in energy trading. I've also worked in electric vehicles and using EVs as batteries. And now I work at Tapestry. And I think there's a number of kind of canonical use cases with how AI is sort of applied into the energy space. These things include forecasting, figuring out sort of what the future state or kind of energy supply and demand look like in the grid. There's also a piece on optimization. How do you coordinate the sort of delivery of that electricity in sort of a an economic and equitable way. But I think some of the most interesting sort of advancements for me right now is how it relates to some of the sort of agentic AI that we've been seeing today. I think one of the challenges in the energy space is that energy is highly esoteric, technical, and complicated. This manifests itself in sort of the policy making and the regulatory constraints that are put in place. If you've taken a look at any of these documents from, say, the California Public Utilities Commission, it is quite dense. This information is difficult to parse and access. The tools required to conduct technical analysis are quite technical, complex, and esoteric as well. And I think ultimately, and working on the power grid and working on energy, it's very, very interdisciplinary. There's a lot of different stakeholders at play, not just technical folks, but policymakers, analysts, local communities, right? And I think there's been traditionally a sort of a gap or a siloing between how these different entities are able to coordinate with one another to work on the sort of single single point of interest, which is the grid and how energy gets delivered in sort of a sustainable, resilient, and equitable way. So I really think that AI has a lot of potential here, and indeed we've seen advancements in this in sort of facilitating the kind of stakeholder connection, facilitating collaboration, and being able to navigate this sort of web of very complicated sort of regulatory policies in place.
So Samir, you're on the financial side now. Are you seeing AI in your investments? And how does that affect your investment decisions?
Yeah, 100% Naomi. AI is a massive mega force that's really impacting the power infrastructure industry today. I'm sure Christian sees that in his work. And it's really creating huge demand for the type of work that we do on a day-to-day basis, right? We work with a lot of big hyperscalers, a lot of big AI companies, and for all of the projects that we construct and build in-house, me working on the financing side, we need a contract and offtake with a customer. We sell this energy to someone. And so with this huge spike in demand, it's a really, really positive growth for the renewable sector because it often is one of the cheapest sources of power for these hyperscalers. And also a lot of these hyperscalers now increasingly have really, really progressive sustainability mandates, which is really, really awesome. And so they specifically look to partner with different renewable energy developers like the firm that I work at. Google has a great advanced energy team that's doing awesome things. So yeah, I would say it's definitely having a positive impact. And I think it really also highlights the point I made earlier where we're really seeing this awesome surge in the industry where kind of the economic case is aligned with kind of the clean renewable case here.
Yeah. So Lily Joy, have you encountered AI in what you're doing, or do you imagine AI playing a role in what you plan to do?
I think there's a lot of conversation in Indian country and within Indigenous communities about the different regulations that we would like to see be put in place and the ways that we would appreciate a level of ethic when approaching AI and working with Indigenous communities. Obviously, it's a super hot topic right now, and I think that Indigenous communities, in my experience, do move at the pace of relationship. And so when it comes to like what I said before, in any industry that requires resources, it is essential and crucial that Indigenous people are seen as true, meaningful stakeholders. And that means long conversations about what AI would mean for those individual communities. And Indigenous communities, again, are extremely diverse. I don't have the capacity and never see myself speaking for all the tribes within the United States, let alone Indigenous communities across the world. Right now, I know that my own tribe, I'm of two tribes. I'm of Diné and Southern Ute descent and African American descent, but the two tribes that I'm from and the one that I'm enrolled in is the Navajo Nation. And my grandparents live on the part of reservation near Lake Powell. If you've seen like Antelope Canyon on your desktops, it's a very famous part of the Southwest, and it's very iconic now. It's where I spent my summers. It's where a proposed $10 billion data center will be, which will obviously just create a lot of issues that that area has already faced. But prior to that area being a proposed data center, nearby was a coal plant, which was had a really complicated relationship with that area. Page, Arizona, and Clichy, Arizona, where my grandparents live, was really dependent economically on this coal plant. And also, it really impacted the health of my grandparents, my relatives, is very detrimental to the surrounding community. Um, and eventually it ended up being tore down, which was great for the surrounding environment, but really hard economically on some of my family members. I had really close family members that worked at that coal plant. And so when we're thinking about jobs and we're thinking holistically about a community, it means like really sitting down and having those hard conversations um, and it takes time. So when it comes to AI, I don't have a fully formalized opinion on what that means in relationships to tribes, other than I know that we need to lead with a very fortified understanding of what tribal sovereignty means and letting tribes use that sovereignty. I think that would be my 2 cents on AI and Indigenous people, is that we just don't know yet. And what we do know is when we move at high paces where we're not engaging with marginalized communities, uh, we're at a disadvantage for really understanding what the potential impacts and negative impacts of entering those communities is.
Everything everyone has said has raised a lot of questions in my mind, and I'm sure in the audience. And if the audience would like to ask questions, if you put your questions in the chat, we'll ask them for you to our panel at the end. All of this is complicated. It's complicated financially. It's complicated with different interests of different community members. It's complicated in our attitudes towards tech, towards the planet. So Samir, when you hear Lily Joy talk about that, so how do you, when thinking about investments, think about the communities that are going to be served by these investments? I'll give you one example for me, which is another example that I find related to what Lily Joy said, which is I live in a seaport community. And in Massachusetts has been a very great supporter of offshore wind. And we have a completed offshore wind project, which is currently on hold, but it's not easy. It's complicated because we are also the richest commercial fishing port in the country. So the fishermen here have a very different view about what is sustainable and what is not. They look at sustainability for what they are going out to fish. A lot of us look at sustainability about energy use. So Samira, how do you analyze this in this complicated context?
Yeah, in terms of working with communities, when we're building renewable energy projects, we need to work very, very closely with communities. And oftentimes we actually are incentivized to prioritize communities where there might be historical fossil fuel energy, or there might be historical coal mines, or there might be historical contamination with the land. And we're incentivized to develop these renewable energy projects in partnership with these communities due to different tax credits. There are actually different adders in the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed a couple of years ago, unfortunately, to be phased out in the near future, called the Energy Communities Adder, that incentivize renewable energy developers to work closely with communities for like a monetary outcome. It would increase kind of the amount of tax credit renewable energy developers would get on their project by a margin. And so we actually spent a lot of time working with different communities, and our landowner relationships for the projects we're developing are some of kind of the most important. Um, we need a lot of land to build these renewable energy projects, right? And so it's definitely a huge priority for us. And we have a whole development team kind of built out internally alongside our deals team that works really closely with these communities.
And Christian, in your work, I don't know if you tailor any of your work to the variety of communities that are affected by your work.
Yeah, I think right now we are not tailoring specific communities. I think ultimately the perspective that I have and that Tapestry has is that there's a lot of different stakeholders within the grid, and there needs to be coordination both kind of in sort of a relationships perspective, an incentives perspective, and a technological perspective to make sure that the sort of grid is able to meet the current moment that we have. There's many challenges facing the grid today related to aging infrastructure, related to the changing dynamics of supply and demand, and also sort of the sort of increasing like climate stresses that this aging infrastructure is facing, right? And I think to that point, like historically, the way in which the grid has been planned, operated, and conducted has been in a very sort of controlled and sort of centralized way. There was a very high barrier to entry to sort of engage with sort of some of the policies, information, and decisions that are being made. And I think my perspective is that to have a grid that is resilient, that meets the moment, is to be able to make this as open as possible, right? To make sure the data is open, the decision making is open, how people participate and engage with the grid is open. There's also been historically sort of siloing of what's called the transmission and the distribution grid. Transmission grid is sort of the longer scale sort of infrastructure that sends power over very large regions, and then distribution is grid is how that power is actually delivered to communities and to individuals and homes and people. And there's been poor coordination between distribution and transmission, and we believe that closing the gap there, making things more open, is a way to sort of invite other stakeholders, other communities to engage in the decisions that we're making for the grid.
Well, how do you do that? I mean,
Yeah.
it seems to me there are huge obstacles ahead of you to try and do that, which would also involve what Lily Joy is doing, what Samir is doing. What are the chief challenges there? And maybe Lily Joy, Samir might have a couple of ideas how to get through those.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think, there's maybe the sort of, I could give a slightly technical answer to start, and then maybe I'll zoom out a little bit. I think the technical answer is that the sort of the data and the tools required to sort of understand the grid and to sort of operate against it and to simulate, analyze it, make decisions. Like there's a lot of complexity and deal with those things. There's a lot of siloing, incompatibilities, like in an inability to interoperate that makes it sort of a technical challenge, and that's indeed something that we're trying to solve, right? In addition, I think there's sort of the challenge from maybe like a sort of a regulatory or market design or incentive alignment perspective, right? And making sure that, I think ultimately, if you sort of look at, if you peel away all sort of the regulations and layers, like I think the sort of a more efficient and resilient grid is a benefit to everybody. I think the way in which that is implemented from a policy and market design perspective is often challenging or is sort of an imperfect proxy for that. So I believe also there needs to be sort of changes, or improvements or advancements to making sure that the sort of market and regulations are designed in a way such that the sort of incentives or sort of needs or priorities of local communities and also businesses or developers are all aligned.
Lily Joy, how much input and how much sway have Indigenous communities? I know I'm talking about a broad scope of a lot of different situations, but from your experience, what kind of influence and ability to have a say in doing what Christian is talking about have Indigenous communities had?
I encourage when there is an ability to start any project in an area where there's Indigenous people, especially particularly federally recognized tribes, because they do have a sovereign nation relationship with the United States, to have and sit down and have really long conversations. Again, like I don't have the ability to speak to all the different myriad of ways of Indigenous people are considering AI. I know there's been a lot of pushback, and I think that it makes sense given the history of the United States and given the history of industries coming in with their own agenda. And I think that this is actually there could be an opportunity, depending on tribal feedback, to change that dynamic and remake it in different ways. Again, it's not exactly my area of expertise. What I do know is that, like any climate solution, AI is not going to be a silver bullet, and neither is traditional ecological knowledge. It's going to require a lot of different systems and ways of thinking coming together to combat this global existential crisis that we're facing. I'm really excited about the prospect of Indigenous people having more say when it comes to owning lands, when it comes to implementing traditional ecological knowledge. Stanford has been hiring a professor in TEK. It's something that is growing in interest. And Indigenous communities, we have so much more to offer than just being also a stakeholder within a given conversation. I am wary of just framing the future as something that's being imposed on Indigenous communities, whereas Indigenous people have been here since time immemorial and have been innovating and have been there for every step that we have made into the future. Indigenous people are resilient, and not just resilient, we have great ideas. Indigenous people have changed alongside the land, and that comes with just the relationship that we have with it. I mean, I don't say that Indigenous people should have um, land rights and the ability to conserve and exert our knowledge from some type of mystical, uh, fantastical way that sometimes people like to frame Indigenous people. Indigenous people deserve to be funded because it is cost effective and because we have the expertise and the ability to do so. It's something that we have seen time and time again be successful when it is funded, when there are Indigenous people included. Conservation projects that have real, not just consultation, but real, like, Indigenous people having those co-management capacities, those projects are more successful than where Indigenous people are kind of like either like in the background, there for a meeting or so, or not involved at all. And so Indigenous people are innovators amongst ourselves. I think that as we give this new technology a chance, this is also an opportunity for us to look at what has worked in the past and look at the ways Indigenous people can be shapers of the future and not just bystanders, because we're not and we never have been.
Yeah. Each of you faces different challenges and obstacles in the work that you're doing, and some of them overlap. Samir, what's the biggest obstacle you face in your work?
Yeah.
Small question.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I'll provide a perspective away from the renewable energy side of things and talk more about kind of some of the work that I do in the climate entrepreneurship ecosystem. And so to answer your question, I would say fragmentation, right? And I think that's the gap that I'm really trying to fill with university climate ventures. And I mean fragmentation in that we see a lot of venture capital and money for entrepreneurs being really concentrated in one place in the world, Silicon Valley. And how lucky are we to kind of have benefited from that, going to college in the area? But I spent a lot of time thinking about why Stanford has been such an engine for climate tech companies. I mean, the statistics for um, climate for Stanford Climate Ventures, the outcomes are unreal, over $2 billion raised cumulatively. Um, and it's all because of this ecosystem we have around Stanford, right? Where VCs talk to freshmen, where experienced founders have to normalize risk for other founders on campus who are just students when they're young, right? But you don't have that at a lot of the other universities around the world. Um, And so what University Climate Ventures is trying to do is kind of bridge that gap between all of the concentration of founders and investors we have in Silicon Valley with other schools on the East Coast as well. And so I'm really excited about working on fragmentation through UCV.
Christian, how do you feel about that Stanford influence and the influence that has come to Stanford? How did that shape what you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that to Samir's point, Stanford has an incredible community and attracts a lot of innovators in sort of the sustainability, climate, and energy spaces. And I think sort of to share a little bit more about my personal story, coming into Stanford, I grew up in Tokyo and while I was living there, there was an energy crisis. There was an earthquake that knocked out a lot of the power sector, and I think I sort of firsthand saw the impact. What a sort of a lack of sort of a resilient energy system could have on millions of people. So I wanted to dedicate my career to this. I think so. I approach it from a very specific perspective, but I think at Stanford there's so many interdisciplinary folks like Lily Joy or Samir, and I think that exposure of all the different perspectives really revealed to me sort of how interconnected and complicated the space is, but also showed all the different opportunities to collaborate there. So I think to speak to a couple of specific experiences that I had that were very helpful, I'm really grateful for my time in the Energy Resources Engineering department. I was exposed to both energy systems modeling, but also sort of some of the oil and gas space, understanding how that worked. I taught the Tomcat Center, which sort of supported a lot of early stage startups and student internships. I benefited from that and got exposure to the solar industry through that. I had the opportunity to work on research, in sort of CO2 sequestration technology to help reduce emissions. And I think this has sort of filled in my brain like a lot of different points of perspective. And I think the crisis that we're facing, the challenge we're facing, is an interdisciplinary one. And I think I've been able to sort of draw upon that diverse set of experiences in ways that I've often not expected. And I really credit Stanford for being able to do that.
Lily Joy, how did Stanford shape your direction? Were you, when you came to Stanford, were you intent on working in the area of climate and sustainability, or did that develop at Stanford?
I actually came to Stanford working primarily on the missing murdered Indigenous people crisis. For those who don't know, Indigenous women are 10 times more likely to be murdered than their white women counterparts. 80% of Indigenous women experience some type of violence in their lifetime, and half of Indigenous women are sexually assaulted. So those are really hard statistics to sit with, and it's what I spent a lot of my time at Stanford in my beginning years considering, figuring out how to make Indigenous women uh, safer. I'm very grateful to have a father who is a professor of federal Indian law, so I've just really immersed myself in all also the different ways that Indigenous people can advocate for the safety of our women and the safety of our communities. What's also really interesting and unique about the missing murdered Indigenous people crisis is that 96% of the violence that happens to Indigenous women is by non-Indigenous people. So whereas we see a lot of violence happening within people's race, and sexual violence often happens within people by proximity being around the same racial groups, Indigenous people, that's not the phenomenon. And after spending a lot of time on that, I just have a love for the role that Indigenous women play in my communities and in many Indigenous communities. Majority of them, I would say, not all, are just integral. Within my particular tribe, the Navajo Nation, like my Navajo introduction is so I start with my mother's clan, and then I go on from there. But you start with your mother's clan because it's a matrilineal tribe. And my mother started her introduction with her mother's clan, and so on and so forth. And like Indigenous women being integral to every part of Indigenous life, they are extremely integral to the ability for tribes to implement what we consider to be sustainable practices, traditional ecological knowledge. A lot of that exists within the ability for Indigenous people are just Indigenous women are just carriers of tradition and knowledge. And so when we look at implementing TEK and all these things, we have to be able to protect Indigenous women. And so I did a lot of study about where is the most documented places where we're seeing this violence occur. And Indigenous women are at the highest and most documented risk in the United States. It's highest around extractive industries. And so this is a really big talking point that I feel like got kind of lost when we think about No DAPL and the Dakota Access Pipeline. There was a huge fight against this pipeline, in part because of the extraction and violence that occurs when extractive industries come into clearing reservations.
So I'm going to ask, what does that mean for the future and being able to protect the climate with new technologies and old technologies. If it's those high monetary value changes that have been concomitant with violence to women. So
Yes.
how do you move forward for the future for sustainability without the violence attached?
I think it again comes back to talking with the tribes, because we see these high hotspots of violence are because when extractive industries, particularly oil, comes into communities, they have they have what is called in slang like man camps, and they come in for 3 to 4 months. And when their presence is tied to violence against Indigenous women in those areas. And Indigenous communities have advocated for background checks, have advocated for there not to be there for long periods of time. There's a myriad of reasons and different approaches that could come in having a conversation with tribes to at least mitigate the violence. In addition to all that, the
So do you
extractive
think
industry.
new kinds of sustainable energy and could lead to that, Samir? You're looking at different areas of investment for energy and mitigating climate change. Do you see places where you wouldn't have to have all this incursion upon local communities, whether they're Indigenous communities or small working class communities? Do you see areas that you're investing in that might be better fits into existing communities?
Yeah, that's a great question. To be frank, I'm not the closest to the development side of the business. Um, and so don't have the best perspective here. What I would say though is that, like I mentioned earlier, um, it's so important to work with these communities throughout kind of the development life cycle. We're putting steel into ground. And so because we're building something on any other, whether it's a landowner, whether it's an indigenous community, any type of population, it's so important to work with them to understand kind of their perspective on the land, their value of the land, different nuances that they may know better than us as developers, as project developers, right? Um, and I haven't experienced it personally, but I know in the industry, it is definitely a big issue that occurs in the renewables, in the infrastructure development industry, period. Fossil fuels especially, right? I remember a lot of my time spent in high school on the advocacy side of things. We spent a lot of time um, lobbying against different fossil fuel infrastructures that was developed on indigenous land, that was developed on land that was majority BIPOC. And so I definitely can acknowledge as someone in this industry how big of a problem it is and how it is important it is to kind of throughout the project life cycle from development, land siting, line selection to actually operating the asset in real time after it's constructed, how important it is to work with communities.
Yeah, we've talked about what you guys are doing, some of the complications. Um, when any of us look at protecting the planet and the future, it can be pretty discouraging because there are a lot of obstacles out there, a lot of hurdles, and as all three of you mentioned, it's not all straightforward and easy. But we can't do any of this without hope, right? And one of the great reasons for having this discussion is because we want hope for the future, and you guys are a part of that. So I'm going to throw this to you first, Christian. When you think of hope for the future, what's your hope for the future?
Yeah, I mean, I hope that we live in a world where energy is abundant, resilient, and cheap and distributed equitably to everybody. That's my hope. And I think for many, many years, energy was not an exciting place to work. It was something that everyone took for granted. I think a lot of the challenges that we're seeing today has shown a spotlight on how desperately we need to innovate there. And I think there's a lot of pressure and momentum building in the space. And indeed, FERC, which is like the Federal Energy Regulatory Committee, they are starting to take concrete steps towards making innovation and transformation possible in the space. There's a lot of interest in here, so I'm hopeful that the spotlight that energy now has is going to really accelerate the transformation that we need.
Lily Joy, what do you hope that you can accomplish?
I came to climate because I was tired of being reduced to just Indigenous trauma. Indigenous people have so much more to offer than what we are given in terms of space and what we are portrayed as. When it comes to No Dapple, when it comes to the missing word Indigenous people crisis, what's upstream of all these issues to me is tribal sovereignty and the ability for tribes to assert themselves, the ability for Indigenous people to assert themselves, not just as stakeholders, but as innovators, as imaginatives, as creatives in this space, as leaders in this space. And so, Indigenous people, we have what gives me hope is that Indigenous people have had the ability to create sustainable and flourishing relationships with the land, and we are not gone as people. We are not fading away. We are not fading away into existence. We have been around on these lands. We will continue to be around on these lands. We have incredible things to offer, and they're rooted in history. They're not rooted in any type of magic or abstract thought. There's people in every single state across America. There's people every place across the world that know how to have relationships with the land in ways where we are not ending back up in these specific scenarios. So I think in whatever field it is, whether it's AI or finance, I think that putting Indigenous people in their own box that is excluded from the major conversation is not just a disservice to Indigenous people or to marginalized communities, whatever community that we're talking about. It's a disservice to the collective as a whole as we are facing the climate crisis.
Good point. Samir, you've seen this from many sides. I mean, and started early, started young. So what's your big hope for the future?
I think there are two things that make me really hopeful. Number one, I think young people now more than ever are caring a lot about really adverse problems and challenges that humanity is facing, including climate change. Um, and I think that's always really inspiring. I run a club on campus, and each year we see another wave of freshmen so eager to work on sustainability at Stanford and get involved in that ecosystem on campus. And that's been one of the most fulfilling components of my experience there has been working with so many young people at Stanford coming in, just freshmen, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, so eager to work on sustainability, and that gives me a lot of hope. Um, and yeah, I think this AI mega force is just kind of the first of many industry shifts we're going to see where a lot of economic outcomes are very much so aligned with sustainability outcomes, renewable energy outcomes, the clean outcome. And so I have a lot of hope for kind of industry shifts towards a more sustainable future. And there's a lot of companies that are building climate tech companies that are just better, faster, and cheaper than the status quo. And those companies give me a lot of hope as well, because that's how you scale and that's how you win and that's how you implement these technologies in the real world.
Well, I'll give you my hope for the future. As a park ranger, one of the delights of my job is swearing in junior rangers. And part of that pledge is to protect the lands and the resources of the all national parks. And the joy that I see in those young people when they take that pledge gives me hope that perhaps they'll grow into you guys. So, but now we've got some questions from people who have been listening. And let me see, Melissa has been collecting them for me. This is for Christian from Adele. The utility sector is notoriously risk averse, relying on legacy software because the math is fully auditable. How is your team tackling the challenge of explainable AI from a technology standpoint?
Yeah, this is a very great question, and I think I can I can provide a very like deep technical answer and go into the nuance of that, but I think I'll set that aside and maybe say that interpretability will always be important in this space, and I do not think there is a world where anyone would be willing to accept a black box solution. So I think interpretability is top of mind. I think in addition, trust and familiarity with tools are really important. I think it's also important to meet the industry where they're at. So I actually think there's a world where you have complementary technologies. You could have both sort of say machine learning based or AI based models to sort of make predictions validated by some of the sort of classical and trusted physics based simulations that are already trusted in the industry. And I think we sort of do not view them as direct competition to one another, but we view them as sort of um, complementary tools and pieces, right? That we need to sort of support and deliver analysis around to meet the industry where they're at. So actually, the view that I have is one in where we want to um, utilize and leverage all these tools together.
Great. A few years ago, a NASA study, this is from Don, a few years ago, NASA study reported that if everyone on the planet were to have the average North American's resource usage, we'd need 4.7 planets worth of resources. How are you grappling with equity issues in your work and the fundamental questions of consumption? Consumption is a big issue for everyone here. Samir, do you look at consumption issues when you're looking at investment?
Consumption issues.
Well, how do the companies you're investing in address consumption issues? Because I don't think that we've all on this planet bought into mitigating our consumption, right?
Yeah. Yeah, totally. I mean, you're seeing so many climate tech startups today building entire businesses off of consumption, from circular economy startups to um, clean fashion startups. I think there's a lot of opportunity in this space. Um, I think a good example of this is 12. It's a startup I interned at when I was a sophomore. And essentially, they're solving a huge problem in the jet fuel consumption space, right? Like jet fuel is very harmful to the planet. And what they're doing is they're building a um, clean closed loop cycle to produce SAF, sustainable aviation fuel. And so I definitely think there are a lot of climate tech startups out there that are truly building entire business models off of problems related to consumption. I mean, 12 is now like past a unicorn. They've raised over $800 million in total funding, which is really, really exciting because I think it really showcases that hey, if you understand the levers and the incentives of industry, you can build massive businesses that solve problems in consumption, while also being fruitful businesses and making money. Because I think when you kind of have those incentives aligned, that's truly how you scale businesses over the long run.
Yeah. Louis Joy, you have any thoughts about consumption? It's a tough issue because we tend to approach our own lives separately and consume, and we think, well, maybe I can make this change, but not that change. And how do we face issues of consumption in the future?
I think that I learned a lot about consumer ethics and the what it means to consume even like when you think of like animal products from a young age from just growing up in tribal community. For example, like my family comes from a lineage of sheep herders and sheep butcherers. So when Indigenous people, well, within Navajo Nation, it's a really common tradition to have a butcher for a ceremony, and everybody takes witness to uh, the of the murder of the sheep. And then everybody plays a role in and literally utilizing every single part of that animal to using the wool for rugs and for tapestries, for using even the intestines for different parts and for different things. Like every single part of the animal is there's a respect for it in the way that we take apart the animal. And I think it changed my entire relationship with how I eat any animal product, eating a burger, going to the store. If more people understood just the what goes into anything, any product that they are taking, and all the different layers that and harm and that goes into those instances, I think that we would learn a lot more. I think also like there's a lot to be said about how Indigenous people, there is so many webs of co-benefits that can be explored when we look at different traditional ecological practices. When we even look at fire ecology and prescribed burns, there are so many other effects, and even looking at like the ashes and all the different things that have been used, because there is a huge emphasis on not wasting in Indigenous communities. So when I think about consumption, I think about the different ways Indigenous people have highly discouraged waste, especially when it pertains to animals, plant life, because there is a general ethic in Indigenous communities that they are living beings that deserve a high level of respect. And so when you have that level of respect for the living world around you, you are able to you are able to have different relationships when it comes to consumption of those.
I think that, yeah, I think that's an important notion, because in the world that most of us live in, we're not thinking about that. We're not thinking about that in the day to day. And Christian, of course, almost all of what you do is about consumption. We don't have a lot of time left, but did you have something to say about what we can do about consumption and energy?
Yeah, absolutely. Just to take the energy specific view, I think the reality is the grid is highly inefficient. There's a lot of headroom and sort of redundancies baked in for the 1% of cases. And I think that there's an increasing recognition that there is tremendous opportunity from like a technological perspective to get more out of the existing grid and infrastructure. I think that the sort of the scarcity of energy that certain communities or organizations are feeling right now is a testament to that. So I do think we are on the path of getting more and more out of what we already have. So I'm hoping to see that momentum continue.
It's great. Thank you. I want to thank everyone for joining us, and I want to thank our panelists for a lot of inspiring thoughts and for hope for the future. You are genuinely rising stars, and I'm sorry we didn't get to all your questions, but there was a lot to take in here, and you guys have given me what I most want, which is hope. So thank you to all, and thank you for the support from Climate Action Forum and Stanford Alumni for Sustainability. And let's hope that we have more Stanford alumni rolling up their sleeves and working for a sustainable world. Thank you so much, and have a good day and a good rest of your climate week. Bye-bye.